Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Roast beef, cheese, and mayo on whole wheat bread sounds like a pretty decent sandwich. But one homeless man didn't think it tasted good enough. Mind you, it was in a homeless shelter. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. Homeless man demands a made-to-order sandwich. I work at a homeless shelter. We serve our residents 3 meals a day out of food donated to us by the food bank. We don't pick out the food ourselves, so every day we just have to make meals out of whatever food we have at the time. On this particular day, I was helping prep and serve lunch, and that day we'd been given roast beef, cheese, mayonnaise, and whole wheat bread, so that's what we made that day's sandwiches out of. Edit, we were also serving apples, oranges, raisins, chips, and cookies alongside the sandwiches. As I'm serving lunch, one of the residents comes up and asks me if we have ham sandwiches. Me. Today's sandwiches are roast beef. Resident. I only eat ham. Me. Sorry, we only have roast beef today. Resident. But I wanted ham. Me. Well, we only have roast beef today. That's what was donated to us. We don't have any ham. Resident. I want ham, and I only eat white bread. Me. Sorry, today we only have whole wheat. Resident. I want a ham sandwich on white bread. Me. I'm sorry, I can't make you a special sandwich. This is what we have, take it or leave it. He eventually did take one of the roast beef sandwiches, but it just amazes me that he seriously thought he could special order a sandwich from a homeless shelter that has limited food and gives everyone the same thing. This is a shelter, not Subway. Generally, people here are happy just to be fed. And our second story. Height approved. It was about 25 years ago, so I was about 8, and we just moved into a 150-year-old house that was in need of major repairs. My dad, thinking ahead, knew he'd need a large garage/workshop to really get started on the renovations properly. On the edge of our yard was an ancient barn that was falling apart and needed to be torn down. My dad figured this was the best place to build his new workshop, so that was the plan. We had met and were on good terms with all the neighbors at that point. When the plans for the new workshop were finished, my parents went around to all the neighbors as a courtesy to show them the plans and get their blessings. The neighbors whose property the current barn and new workshop would border, I'll call them the Peters, were concerned about the height. The existing barn was 16 feet high, and they asked if we could only build it 1 story, 12-foot max, as to not block the sun in their yard. Sure, no problem. My parents agreed. They wanted to go 2 stories for extra storage, but just 1 wasn't a deal breaker. So the old barn was torn down and the foundation laid for the new one. During that time, there was a falling out with the Peters and my parents. I'm not sure what happened, but it turned nasty. One day, my brother and I were playing street hockey and Mr. Peters came out yelling at us, "Get off the road, you half-breed craps!" We're both half-black. "You have to earn your place in this town." Upon hearing this, my mom had to physically restrain my dad from going over there and beating the living crap out of him. Eventually, he cooled off and started on his plan. The plans for 1 story went out the window. Soon, the new garage that was only supposed to be 1 story soon gained a second in the blueprints. As construction started, the Peters came over to ask why there were 2 stories being built and were told to go F themselves. We didn't hear from them again until the roof started to go on. The bylaws of the township limited all structures to 24 feet high. The Peters called the township and then a building inspector claiming the new garage was over 24 feet high. If it was over height, the entire thing would have to be torn down and rebuilt, costing us tens of thousands of dollars. I remember the Peters standing there watching the inspector with smug looks on their faces. 2 days later, we got the final report back from the township and inspector, 23 feet 11 inches, just as my dad had drawn up in his new plans. He sent me up on the roof of the garage, just plywood, no shingles yet, with some spray paint and had me write 23 feet 11 inches, height approved, in 2-foot-high neon orange letters across the entire roof facing their yard and house. Not only did the garage block all sunlight from reaching their yard, but my dad waited until everything else was done before he shingled that side of the roof. They had to stare at those neon orange letters for almost 3 years. It may not be much, but it certainly ruined the enjoyment of their newly darkened yard, and there was nothing that could be done about it because it was height approved. They didn't comply with the Peters' request, but they certainly complied with the bylaws as maliciously as they could. Lawful evil is best evil when it's you. And our last story. Entitled woman thinks she can scare my father into buying her a brand new car. Backstory. My dad is a car mechanic for over 30 years and is now self-employed for like 25 years. He has a very good reputation too, and is one of those people who always tries to not get in any argument at all costs, just like myself. This whole situation happened like 2.5 years ago and over the course of several months. I can clearly remember that day, and it shakes me every time I think about it. It was the end of the first week of summer break here in Germany, and I had an eerie feeling and got up from our couch to walk towards the front door and saw smoke coming out of the open door of our garage and asked my mom what my dad was doing today. She answered that he was welding and why I asked. I then got in action and told her there was smoke coming out of the open garage door. She came down out of our office where she wrote bills for my father's clients. We then went out there and found out that the car was on fire because the main wires of the electrical system were on fire. Thankfully, my dad had already gotten out from under the car. We then rolled the car out of the garage while my mother called the fire department. By the time she was calling them, one of the firefighters, which just so happens to be our next-door neighbor, came rushing over with his fire extinguisher and helped to clear the fire. His wife had seen what was happening and had told him to hurry up. We already had used our fire extinguisher and were relieved that our neighbor was there helping us in a professional manner. By the time the fire department arrived, the fire was already under control, and they just had to basically cool the car down so that it for sure wouldn't begin to burn again. The car itself hadn't so much of damage, but the whole wires for the basic functions of the car were destroyed. So it was basically totaled, even though the body was fully intact. The police were also called and asked us what happened. They said that there weren't going to be any consequences out of this for my father because the fire was already under control when the firefighters came. They all went and said we should all go inside and calm down a little after what had happened. FYI, it wasn't a full-blown fire, thankfully. There was just a lot of smoke and heat. I think everybody can understand that I was still in shock and that I was just glad that my father was unharmed and that I had this bad feeling. I still think that everything would have been gone for the worst had I not had this bad feeling and gotten up to look out our front door. So after we'd all calmed down a bit, my dad went to the woman who owned the car and told her what happened. He even wanted to pay her 2,000 or 3,000 euros so that she could buy a new car. Her now destroyed car wouldn't have brought more than 500 euros if she'd sold it before it caught fire, and also wanted to help her find a good one. Through internet, he knows what to look for. So this lady would basically have nothing to do, but she declined everything, except that we wanted to cancel her insurance for the car, so my mother went to the registration office and signed out the car. So we thought this was the happy ending, but no, unfortunately not. Now comes the Karen of this story into play. I think it was 3 weeks later when my father got a letter from the police stating that someone had filed charges against him for intentionally setting the car on fire. He was supposed to come to an audience the next week or so that the process could begin. At this point, I was baffled that this entitled woman thought that she could get even more money from my father than he was offering her by pressing charges against him. She always seemed to be a nice lady. My mom was instantly furious and said to my father that we now need a lawyer. So that's what my dad did. The next day, he had his first meeting with his lawyer, who then spoke to the police that my dad didn't set the car on fire, which could also be read in the official report of the police officers, which were called the day of the fire. So we thought that was it. But the lady had also a lawyer and wanted all the money she needed to buy a brand new car and the money she had to spend to get doctor's appointments. She's like 70 or something, so she has a lot of doctor's appointments. This went back and forth until she altogether stopped to pay her lawyer and also stopped to answer his calls and emails. She seemed to be impatient and thought she didn't have to wait for such a long time for the money she had wanted. A few months went on and we hadn't heard from her or her lawyer when suddenly 3 police officers, 2 women and a man, showed up at our home. We'd just gotten rid of the car, which stood all the time in our courtyard. We'd given that lady a lot of time to get it off our property, and when she didn't meet the deadline or heard anything from her lawyer to get more time, our lawyer allowed us to get it towed from our courtyard. They'd been eyeing my car, which is from the same brand, and thought that this was the car they were looking for. My mom was alone at home when they came and told me this when I came back from school later that day. At that point, I hadn't had my driver's license yet. The man was like, "We wanted to inspect that car over there." Mom: "Why would you want to do that?" Woman 1: "Because of the charges against Dad." Mom: "Then you're too late. That's my daughter's car. The car you're searching for has been removed just yesterday. Also, please speak to our lawyer." Gives them the phone number and address. Then they just went their way. My mother immediately informed our lawyer what had happened. A few days later, our lawyer found out why the police officers were here. The lawyer of the old lady tried to get somehow the money for the work he had done, so he got the highest rank of judge he knew in private to somehow get him his money. In the end, my father had to pay €300 to the state so that the process would be brought to a close, and that was thankfully the end of it. Still to this day, we haven't heard or seen the old lady. They should add a new type of complaint that you can put: Wild Karen. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.